Good evening, everyone. My name is Sister Maria Pascuzzi. I am the Director of Spirit Alive. I want to welcome all of you, especially those joining us from for the first time tonight, on behalf of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Brentwood, New York, whose generous support makes our Spirit Alive programming possible. For our first two roundtables, we had the opportunity to listen to some thoughtful discussion, both critical and hope-filled, about the church. Tonight, in our last roundtable, we're going to have the opportunity to listen to another chronological group, older millennials and Gen Xers, express their thoughts and their feelings about the church. We have a great panel of interesting, very diverse and distinguished guests, and I think you're going to find this discussion lively. So it's a pleasure to introduce tonight's roundtable moderator, Dr. Helen Wolf, who spent many years as an administrator in campus ministry and mission integration, and is now the director of mission integration for the Sisters of St. Joseph of Brentwood, New York. Helen is joined by Megan de Dios. Megan is a former Catholic school teacher and administrator who serves as Director of Continuing Education at the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. Then we have Timothy Foley, an award-winning songwriter and multi-instrumentalist. Timothy currently leads music for services at two parishes in the Diocese of San Diego, and in his spare time, he attends law school. Next, we have the pleasure of having Karen Gargamelli McCrate, who, along with her husband, Sean, founded Benincasa Community in New York City, a lay community of men and women with roots in the Dominican tradition, which is changing the way religious life is practiced and understood today. Our next panelist, Tiffany Hines, was born and raised in Harlem, New York, and is currently the Assistant Provost for Student Engagement and Development at New York Institute of Technology. She's actively involved in the Archdiocese of New York and has been a commissioner of the Office of Black Ministry of the Archdiocese since 2005. And last but not least, we are joined tonight by Dr. Cyrus Olson, a tenured professor in the Theology and Religious Studies Department at Scranton University. But for the current academic year, Dr. Olson is a visiting professor at the University of San Francisco, where he holds the Lo Schiavo Chair in Catholic Social Thought in the Lane Center for Catholic Social Thought and Ignatian Tradition. So a warm welcome to each of you on this very cold night. Before I turn tonight's event over to Helen, let me remind you, viewers, that CC captioning is available. Just click the CC option on your screen if you'd like to read along. There'll be a Q&A period for about 15 or 20 minutes at the end of the panel discussion before our program ends at 8:45. Please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box at any time during the discussion. So welcome again, and Helen, take it away.
Well, here we are. We're finally here. We've been preparing for this for quite a while now, and I'm just so excited that we're going to have this conversation. Thank you, Sister Maria, and all involved with Spirit Alive. Giving us this opportunity to have this conversation tonight is such a grace, and it is so needed. And I want to thank Tim and Tiffany, Megan and Karen and Cyrus, who will engage all of us with their perspectives and life experiences as individuals of faith. But last but not least, I want to thank all of you who are joining us remotely, because I'm hoping that you'll get involved in our conversation by posting your questions in the chat. Then it'll truly be a conversation and a dialogue. It's my hope that tonight will bring us to a deeper understanding of church in our ever-changing world, to help each to find ways to engage our faith more deeply, to consider ways to live belief, to trust the love of our transcendent God in the course of our daily lives. As Sister Maria said, the last panel in the series last month asked questions, and they focused at the beginning with younger millennial and Gen Z Catholics, asking about the joys and strengths of the church, what nourishes them, what fills their hearts. As a religious educator, it was wonderful to hear their connection to the sacraments, to liturgy. Their positivity was inspiring. Well, we'd like to begin tonight by addressing the concerns that our church is facing, particularly the exodus of younger Catholics and others who are marginalized for one reason or another. So my apologies if it sounds like we are starting off on a negative note, but given that we have limited time together tonight and the fact that I was born in Brooklyn, let's get right to it. So I'm going to ask Karen to start us off, and I want to pose a question to you. I've been looking at some of the statistics that the Center for Applied Research of the Apostolate came out with this past year. They've been tracing statistics in the Catholic Church since 1970. And there were two things that struck me, which I think might get us started tonight in our conversation. One is that over the past 50 years, Catholic adults who no longer identify as Catholic jumped from 3.5 million in 1970 to almost 31 million in 2021.
Wow.
And during that same time frame, Catholics attending Mass weekly dropped 68%. So here's my question. Why do some of your peer group stay with the church when so many walk away?
Great. I mean, the question is a question that I'm asking myself every day, and is a question that's front and center with so many people that I am walking through life with, journeying through life with. So I'd say, just to begin, it's so hard to define what staying and what walking away looks like, right? Like, are the women religious a part of the church, or are you outside of the church? Is church going to Mass? You know, what is staying? Where are the boundaries? It's a hard question to ask or to answer. But if you bear with me, I have a few thoughts about if we don't have time to define staying and going, let me sort of break down very quickly some of the factors that I think keep people in that constant conversation and that constant discernment, which is exhausting to have to constantly be in this conversation about church. But I've got 4 things that I think are helpful in understanding. One is investment. So I feel like those of us who got good formation and who were given real opportunities to take leadership in a parish are more likely to stay. And I don't mean like crap surface level education. I mean real historical, critical thinking, theological frameworks. If we invest in our church and in their education, I think that kind of formation pays off later, right? Like, we're more likely to stay. And I think real leadership, like actual leadership opportunities. And of course, the obvious is priesthood, but I think leading retreats, religious education, parish councils, right? Like real meaningful opportunities for leadership. I think authentic spiritual experiences matter. This is sort of my second factor. If you've experienced God in a church setting, I think that's more likely to have you stay. So not just this is what you should experience, or this is what someone telling you what God is or isn't, but having an authentic experience, I think matters. I think community ties, and this is something that's important to me and my friends. If your family or your community group is tied to church, I think you're more likely to stay. And I think that's also very painful if you can't stay because your primary group is connected to church. So I'm thinking of baptisms and funerals and weddings and the things that mark a life. If that's tied to church, then we're staying. And I also think if you can't stay because church is painful, oh my God, how much more painful for you?
Well, you know what? Those are great points, Karen. Let's stop for a second.
Sure.
And let's see if anybody else wants to hop in on this conversation. I saw some heads nodding.
I don't want to pre-talk about what I might be talking about earlier, but I used to do campus ministry in a high school. I did teach in Catholic high school. And basically,
Can't hear you, Timothy.
I'm sorry.
Get a little closer to the mic.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. Karen, I mean, what you're saying is exactly true. You know, I mean, I can also speak to my own. I have pain and I have things that I've experienced and things that make me feel disassociated, but yet it's because of the formation, because of the leadership opportunity, because of the authentic spiritual experiences I had. Because there are days where I wake up and say, why am I still here? But it's because of that. I can't erase that from my experience and my consciousness, my soul.
Yeah. My last point, which I think probably also, Timothy, you feel, is a church that does justice. So if you're able to connect social justice to church, I think you're likely to have that be sort of a staying factor.
That was a big focus of our campus ministry. And it's been 10 years now since I taught, but that's it. You know, the students were, I just spoke about my own experience, but when we were doing campus ministry, they were had active leadership roles, they were on retreats, they were doing social justice. So it laid a good foundation.
Yeah, and I think the reason people go is sort of obvious too, right? Like there's been a direct harm to you as somebody who is queer, a woman, a person of color, right? Somebody who's been the victim of sexual abuse, right? Like these are the reasons why, despite all of those strong ties, people can't stay,
Anybody else want to hop in on this? No? Okay, Karen, do you think?
I will just as a queer Catholic, and I run an LGBT ministry at our church. It is one of those things where you do think, can I stay? Can I stay? But just to reiterate, it's my church too, and these experiences I've had, are what keep me. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll echo what Karen said about socialization and formation. I mean, I think if you have, to use the ancient Hebraic notion of taste and see the Lord is good, if you've experienced that somehow in community, then you want to hold on to that, right? So I do think that, I mean, I struggle with what George Steiner called the nostalgia for the absolute, right? So I share in the idea that sometimes I don't think God exists, God's absent, I don't know how to experience God, and then am haunted by this desire to return to a position where I might have had that more easily at a younger age or something, and church means that. So if you're longing for that and want that and miss that in your formation as a human person, or even socialized into it, somehow that longing sneaks in and might give you hope to return. So.
Yeah, I would say, Karen, what resonated with me the most is talking about community. In my parish, which is predominantly Black Catholics, I think that's what has kept a lot of us going to church, even in the midst of pastor changes, music changes, all sorts of things that have changed around us that may not necessarily reflect our personal values and cultures, but we keep coming back because of each other. And I think it's that feeling of we are the church, meaning the people of the church, and that we keep it going, and that keeps our faith renewed and us wanting to be there every Sunday, and sometimes even more than Sunday.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you. You know what you made me think about, Karen, when you were giving us your response to that question, was some of the things that are keeping people away from the church. So I'm going to segue into another question, and I'm going to look to Cyrus to answer this one if he doesn't mind. Some bishops have been withholding communion to those who are divorced, those who support women's reproductive choice, and those who support marriage equality. The list can go on, right? So to what extent has such practices pushed those in your generation away from the institutional church?
Okay, yeah, thank you. I think what I'm going to try to do for each of these sections, and I'll use the word hope as I did in the last one in response to Karen's beginning, and I'll just use one word as well, which you can remember to associate with this question for me. And I think I would use the word fear in this case, and I'll say why, but I think that fear and control are closely related, and I think bishops fear loss of control. And so you could use control there as well if you wanted. But for me, I think fear is front and center because people tend to operate out of their spaces of what they're afraid of, right? And so I think there's a real sense that a certain form of leadership that is unfortunately hyper-masculine, patriarchal, and in a way very modeled on a notion of, as my generation would have said in a certain sector, putting the smack down and really bringing a sense of control over the situation, right? And I think that's really rooted in a certain view of what leadership means, and that I can sanction people, and that my role is somehow to get control of the situation and to preserve what is otherwise being threatened. And I think that that's something that just turns off people in my communities and my generation and pushes people away. In some cases, I have to say it doesn't in all cases, right? There are modes of and ways of being that it seems that a traditionalism really captures well. But on average, I think that the sense is that enough of us have been in situations of pain and difficulty, situations of divorce, marginalization, and are wounded and really want to be cared for by the community of the church, but otherwise feel excluded. So I think there's a real loss here in welcoming in and maintaining the space of inclusion and healing that is lost because of fear. And it's not in all communities of the church, not in all places. For example, now that I'm in San Francisco for a period of time, I find the communities there to be very different and to be very welcoming, even in my brokenness and in my alienation from the church and disaffection at times. I find there's a sense of willingness to listen to who I am and where I am, and less demonizing clericalism that sneaks into other communities. And I think there's something about the rhetoric and the positionality of a leader, a bishop who's supposed to be a shepherd, that's contaminated by a hypermasculine patriarchal way of operating in the US that needs to be undermined. And I think that Greg Boyle speaks well to our generation when he talks about expanding kinship, which I'll say is one of my words later again, and belonging, and widening the church to a point where the margins become the center. And I think that that's just kind of this idea of widening circles of kinship and belonging that's not rooted in fear. It's rooted in a sense of exploration and a desire to know others that you don't yet have sorted out. There's a sense that bishops are unwilling to let that exploration happen freely in the space of the church. And I don't know all the reasons why, but I think it has something to do with fear and control. So that's all I have to say there for the moment. Thanks.
Well, Cyrus, when you said that word inclusion, what came to my mind was the understanding of what inclusion really is. Too many people look at inclusion as, okay, you're now part of our group. You figure out how to belong to our group.
Right.
What it should be about is us embracing everything that everyone brings to the group and to celebrate that. Greg Boyle's a great example as well. I love one of his. I had conversations with people who feel that even the use of the word welcome is not necessarily always good either, because you're saying, what do you mean? You're welcoming us into, as you say, your community? Why don't I just belong, right? Why isn't it that the church isn't wide open such that my being here is enough? Why does it have to involve some kind of notion of welcome? I recognize that's a way of envisioning, to use the language of Francis Encounter, where you have to welcome, you have to treat people in a particular way that means you're receiving them well. And maybe that's what we mean, is that in comporting myself to you or to others, that I can receive you in a way that's humanizing and healing. But I think there's a great loss in the pain that many of us feel, and that fuels the disaffection. That if that woundedness, to use the anima Christi, right, hide me in your wounds. If that idea of vulnerability, which is where the word comes from, vulnera and wound, if we can't hide in each other's wounds too and share that, I think there's a real loss to us.
You talked about, when you're talking, it just reminds me, hasn't this always been a problem in our church? And yes, I say problem, meaning an acts like, you have to be circumcised to be a Christian, now, you have to be Roman, Latin to be a Catholic. We've always struggled with this. We're like a club, that you have to fill in. Yet the world that God created is diverse as the sky, the stars in the sky, and Jesus. Not to sound trite, but it's almost like, what would Jesus do? And I laugh at myself by even saying that, but it's Jesus just accepted people. He encountered people. He took them as they are. He reached out to the marginalized. We read this every Sunday, and yet it somehow gets lost in the filter. I don't know, you know.
One of the things that I worry about is the like sort of tossing it up as like they're afraid, or they don't like, you know, yes, it's the patriarchy, yes. But one of the things that has always broken my heart is the active way that the church has sought to do harm. So just two quick examples, one with reproductive rights. The amount of money and time that's gone into lobbying and overturning Roe, like it isn't just like, this is the rule, you have to follow the rule if you're here. It's like, we are going to war and we are going to spend all of our resources to overturn Roe. Like it's so intentional. It's not even, it's so active, it's so violent that it's hard to find inclusion or welcome in a space that's like actively, aggressively going after, like a woman's ability to decide if she's going to have a baby or a birthing person. The other thing is, during the sexual abuse crisis, the amount of money that went into making sure that survivors couldn't bring a claim. It was just like, it was horrifying. Just millions and millions, especially in New York. I mean, Dolan is like, I can't even begin to sort of characterize the kind of person that would spend all of the church's, our money, making sure that victims of sexual abuse don't get help and don't get justice. So I know what the church is supposed to look like. And Cyrus, you're so eloquent about it. I just don't know how to reconcile the violent, active force with like how are we gonna get to welcome if this is how we're,
especially when the Eucharist is weaponized, right? So the idea of publicly weaponizing it and then using it as a way to demonstrate in a performative staging way, you know, I'm going to make it clear that anybody who comes to me either dressed in a particular way or presenting themselves in a particular way, that on this stage I can't be compassionate because the stage requires I perform in a particular way, you know? And exactly. I know it's also politicized, even though I'm not supposed to be political, and yet it goes on and on, right? So,
it is. It's like, it's such a public, performative, and like political entity. It's so like, I feel like to your point, Tim, it's like, it's always been this way. And also I feel like it's beyond the point of return. Like, how can you reel this shit in, you know?
You know, when you were talking about the war and the space, one thing that comes to my head, and this is something that kind of rubs me the wrong way, and I think when people say it, their intentions are good, but we have to be defenders of the faith.
Right.
I don't think God needs me to defend him. God's going to exist. What I think is we need to be livers, right? Doers of the faith, be the hands and feet of Christ.
Yeah.
And this mentality that we have to defend and protect, you know, no, like, let's live Jesus. And how that relates to what you were saying about abortion. I really lamented this whole thing. It gave me time to reflect. I really feel like the church failed in the way it approached that life issue because of what you said. For the last 50 years, they could have been investing billions in education and support for women and support for candidates that really support life, from as Pope Francis has been telling us. But no, they spent it on politics and politicians. And now abortion is even more political than it was. But again, we're not getting into politics here. But yeah, this idea of defending the faith, it's not Jesus.
Karen, those are some very powerful ways to express how things are happening in our church, and those are the kinds of things that are pushing people away, right?
Yeah.
Not just our generation or our younger generations. It's pushing a lot of people away.
Yeah.
So again, this is why this conversation is so important. It really is.
I mean, Tiffany, you are in Dolan's territory, and he just has so much money because it's New York. And, you know, I just sort of wonder, I feel like you're in the belly of the beast. I don't know if you feel that way. I lived in New York for a long time, so it's my own experience, and sort of wondering what you if you feel that way.
So I will say recently I have not felt that way, only because in the ways in which I've been engaged within the church have been through a lot of programs that Catholic Charities has put on, and a lot of the programs or events or even resources that they've given, I've seen it into communities that really need it, which I really couldn't speak to years ago. So I do see the support coming from Catholic Charities in that perspective. There are some ways, of course, for improvement all the time. But most recently, though, you can tell that there's communities that were in need that now are seeing the resources that they probably didn't see before. So I don't know if that was a direct result of, lack of funding, or now people are realizing that, we have to be inclusive and welcoming of all, using those terms, but that means actually being active, like actively doing it. So it's not just saying it, it's not just putting it off on someone else, but it's saying that we have to actively do that and to be the Christians who we're saying we're going to be, as opposed to being hypocrites. We want to definitely, show the actions behind what we see is necessary.
That's great. You're making me think of an article I read a couple of months ago in America Magazine, and I think it was an op-ed. And the article talked about, I wrote the line down that got to me. I wanted to share it with you guys. Dismayed faith leaders and churchgoers alike have been left to ponder whether they are members of a dying species of those who look to God for an understanding of the world. Left to ponder whether they are members of a dying species of those who look to God for an understanding of the world. And I think that speaks to a lot of different religious traditions who seem to be walking away from institutional church. Tiffany, the question I want to ask, I'm asking right now is, are there some changes? I guess it's more than just one. Are there changes that are needed for our participation in the church to somehow be enlivened or renewed?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. We talked about it a lot already, and it's really that I think the church needs to be representative of its members. So I think potential members would be more appealed to come to church, to do service, to engage really with the Catholic Church if they saw that our church is reflective of its members. So that's from, once again, practicing what we preach, right? So if we're saying we're inclusive, we're saying we're welcoming, it's not just, saying, okay, you're welcome to come into this church, but it's incorporating all of those cultures into the music, into the liturgies, into the homilies, really speaking to what people are experiencing. And I think that's what will definitely bring renewed participation. I think it's more than just, saying it, but it's doing it.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and not just its members, right, Tiffany, the ones that left too, right?
Right.
The potential, the former,
Bring them back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. They have to see themselves within the church. I think that's essential.
And to what you said, Helen, that quote about a dying breed who look to God for the answers, and are leaving the institutional church. Well, isn't that it, right? I think a lot of people are spiritual, but they've just found that they've had to leave the church, as Tiffany said, because the church doesn't represent them, doesn't acknowledge them.
Well, that percentage of young or people who are disenfranchising from institutional faiths continues to grow each year. It's hovering somewhere around 28-30% now of folks who call themselves people of faith who now no longer identify with a religious tradition. And that's just not the Catholic Church. That's kind of across the board. So Megan, have you had any of these kinds of experiences with your work up in Boston?
We have, and being in Boston in particular, where one of the first sex abuse scandals broke out, is an interesting location to be because we lost, talking at the beginning of Karen's first question of what is really leaving. I think a lot of people truly left when that happened, and so they found new spiritual homes, or maybe they didn't, and so what now several years later, there are pockets of very vibrant Catholic communities. St. Cecilia's were just featured in America just recently, and I have found that to be a wonderful parish to be a part of. And people that are joining us from all over, I know that their live stream mass during the pandemic, the attendance was in the thousands. And what was special about what they were doing, and I think it goes back to what Cyrus was saying about the welcome and belonging. They do very well there. And that's what the article is about as well. And so even though we're riding the waves of the effects of the crisis, there's still strong communities and they're doing lots of good in our area. The social justice piece is still alive and well.
That's great.
Yeah, and I would say I would use a term that I've come to learn from the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, the social imaginary. It's not only he who uses it, but there's that combined with social practice. We no longer have major cultural moments where we all gather together to be socialized into sacred events, right?
Mhm.
So it's not so much, I mean, we could come to much more high-end intellectual ideas about science and its impact in empiricism and its impact on our ability to appeal to God for explanations in the world. More of us probably go to psychologists or pharmacology than we do to the local priest. So we're all complicit in this, right? But maybe more radically for us, though, is just the idea that we're socialized into patterns of life that no longer include any reference to God. And when God is invoked, we feel really uncomfortable because it's really used in a nasty way, right?
Right.
Either God is invoked by a political figure who wants to use it for their own ends, or and so we're even uncomfortable in a public setting for using the term God in a way that we might not have been at some other point in time. But it's not looking back nostalgically at that time. It's just saying that right now we haven't figured out yet what it means to have a social orientation that would mean it was okay for us to include some kind of reference to God in our explanation of things, because it doesn't make sense to most people who don't have any way of being brought into a way of life where the word God even makes sense. It doesn't land on their consciousness in any way that even hits them as meaningful, because maybe God is simply a word of, it makes them cringe, or a word of abuse. And so it doesn't have any association with an explanatory device that would make sense even in their own lives, you know? And so that's maybe just a socialization problem that we have as people leave and are no longer finding any way to be included in communities of practice. So we might find those more so happening in concerts or other kinds of venues where you have access to, even for myself, where I feel more included in the community by song and dance than I do necessarily in a church, right? So, but I think it has something to do with socialization and then what that does to our imagination. We can't imagine where God fits anymore into even our patterns of life. And I'll just, as an aside, we'll come back to it later, is a totality of the economic system we're in, where we might not have any time even to set aside for God. We're just absorbed by work. So, and we have to, because we're wage laborers, most of us. And so if we're wage laborers and subject to the system, we might work more jobs and then just have less and less time to be actually set aside that would have any meaningful orientation to something other than the market. So.
But you know, Cyrus, I just want to just pop in real quick and just play devil's advocate a little bit with you. I'm not sure if it's just being uncomfortable talking about God. I think people generally still believe in God, still believe in something greater than themselves, still are praying, still consider themselves spiritual. What I think younger generations are doing is they're walking away from the institutions that have so disappointed them because of the decisions that they have made over and over again that just marginalize the marginalized even more. So I think that's a huge part of it.
Yeah, there's more hope in psilocybin and mushrooms than there is in the church right now. So.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And you as a musician, you make a good point. We talk about concerts, you referred to that. I've worked with youth a lot, and just being in music, I'm around a lot of different types of ages. People find a sense of spirituality, but there's a lot of people go to concerts and shows and festivals and they feel fulfilled spirituality. And to what Helen is saying, that's kind of a replacement for these institutions that we have. And why do they walk away? I know we're going to continue to talk about this, right? But and some of it has to do with how this whole conversation started. Their parents, the boomers, left the church. So they didn't have formation, or they grew up in a stale church or a pre-Vatican II church and never had that authentic spiritual experience, maybe not until they got older and went on Cursillo or something like that, And so their children don't have it, and then it passes on to the generation. So people are just raised without that connection with. So some of it is people leaving, and some of it is they just never had it.
Absolutely. And it starts with the silent generation up till now, and every generation's gotten less and less connected to church. I'm sorry, Karen, go ahead.
No, I just am so excited about this because I do feel like part of the problem is that we're like where are the young people? And it's like it's an upriver analogy. The problem started upriver. Like now that it's a trickle. Now the raging river is just a trickle. And you're like, hello, follow the river upward. Like it was the problems, the lack of formation, right? The like inability to transition into modern times, all of that happened generations ago, that happened decades ago.
Mhm.
And so like, you can't fix the problem. You can't like blame the drought, right? Or like say that the problem is the trickle when it's all connected and it happened much earlier.
This has been on my mind. And sorry, did I cut you off, Karen? I don't know if I did. There.
Yeah, I'll say something later. Go ahead, Tim.
I always hear these buzzwords. Oh, the secularization of society. That's an effect. That's not a cause, in my own humble opinion, right?
Yeah.
When you don't go to church and you don't believe in God, then you become secularized. But it's not people are secular. That's what's causing it, right? So they get it reversed,
right? Exactly.
It's like, no, that's the effect of you not participating in this, of you not teaching your children, of you not responding to multiculturalism and technology and new theories about sexuality and women's rights, and that's the result. People are walking away. So secularization is the result, right?
Exactly.
Right. Good point.
That's exactly right. One of the things I just wanted to add while we're here, and because I have baby brain and I'm like, I'm totally gonna forget this. I think, right, there's this like generational divide that's also happening. And I think it's like, we're blaming everybody but the perpetrators, right? Is sort of like part of the issue that's happening here. But I also think, like, I'm looking at you nuns, like there are complicit people who did not protect us, who were like, I'm going to lose my canonical status. Or like they themselves were so oppressed by the church that they like couldn't protect us, right? And I do think like my parents, like, thank God nothing terrible, like too terrible happened to me, but like, where were the people that were supposed to protect the generation that's coming after them? And not saying the next generation doesn't go to church, but like, you didn't protect us from the financial abuse, from the sexual abuse, from, degrading our cultures, right? Like the people that came before us didn't stand up to the church. And so I think like you owe us an apology, not, don't put us on the stand and ask us for an explanation of why we're not here, right? Like,
yeah,
older generations owe us an apology. And I think before we put our children through it, like we need to think seriously about whether we're going to give them mushrooms and therapy after we put them through the church,
Well, Karen, I can throw myself into that category because I was a Catholic grammar and high school teacher in the Brooklyn diocese for over 15 years. I was fearful for my job all along the way because I thought as a religion teacher, and as a woman teaching religion in the Catholic schools, if I said the wrong thing or did the wrong thing, I would, have to pay for that. So I'm complicit in that as well. I think a lot of us are.
Yeah. And it's an oppressive environment. And so the complicity is understandable, but.
Right. And I think, well, let me toss something else out just to jump off of what you guys were saying. We're talking about that trickle down effect, right? Of the generation, the older generation saying things like, why are there no younger people in our church? Why is it just us? How much do you think they're not being willing to face the facts that the church has changed is complicit in this as well, that they're not willing to see that this new generation has wonderful things to offer our church, but they just don't want to change habits. They don't want to change what's, a way of worship or the type of songs we're singing, or priests not giving more dynamic sermons or relating their sermons more to what people are going through on a daily basis. Just going to throw that out there.
I think liturgy is sort of the gateway to our church, right? And it's something that we focus a lot on, and it's an ancient practice, and there's grace in it, regardless of how good or bad it is. I, as a musician, I am very involved in liturgy. I have very strong opinions on it. Now, I don't think everything has to be completely modern, but we can also place too much emphasis on liturgy, because as we know, a lot of like young conservative Catholics want a Latin Mass, so I think a lot of it is tone, and then a lot of it's the feeling, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as people say, right, it's not what you said, but how you made me feel when you said it. And so I think we got to start with that,
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it has to do with what other ministries or groups are available. Yes, of course, it's what the priest talks about. As an LGBT Catholic, if I walk in and he starts saying things about LGBT people going to hell, well, I'm never going back to that church again. So you can, the little things you can say, or, can have an effect. If I talked about how they sometimes they don't acknowledge or don't recognize. Sometimes they don't even see people. If you don't even see the people in your congregation, if you don't realize there's other races and other ways of thinking, of course that's going to have an effect on you. So I think it's a mix, right? It's not just the liturgy, but it's also the tone, the feeling, the outreach.
Oh, so much. Yeah. So Tim, let me throw something at you, just to pick up on this a little bit. What can we do then to re-enfranchise folks, either from the millennial generation or the Gen X generation? What can we do to re-enfranchise them? Those especially who've been marginalized. What would make a difference to these generations in regard to coming back to the church or staying with the church?
I think, first of all, that's a hard part, right? Talking about coming back, re-enfranchise, because it kind of hits on what we were talking about before. I think that
Tim, we can't hear you.
Okay, sorry, I don't know what's wrong. Church has to be relevant. Kids believe in God. Kids have spirituality. They go to concerts. They get spiritual highs by being in groups. And I mean, they do. They just don't find it in church, because when they walk into church, church is not relevant to them. And some of that is because of the formation and leadership, right? And the authentic spiritual experiences. But some of it, they never had at all, right? So you can't blame, like you were saying, come back.
We lost you again.
Yeah.
Has to be relevant.
Yeah.
Okay. Somebody else want to hop in on that?
Well, I think, Tim, like the purpose of church, and I think Cyrus talked about this too a little bit, it's sort of like, we have this great anti-capitalist model. We have this great like other way of being that is relevant when people are suffering from a society that is like grinding people to a halt, just like killing people, right? Like our medical industrial complex, our education industrial complex, literally with our military industrial complex, like we have a culture of death. And the church can be relevant, right? Like the gospel can offer this totally different model that is relevant for right now, and it could be incredibly powerful, but they're so afraid of their own message. Like,
yeah, I mean, I found when I was teaching that what the kids responded to a lot in our Catholic school was the social justice focus. And it's so crazy that that's now a bad word in certain circles. I just don't get that. But yeah, relevant. If you have no connection with church, and then you see this institution that marginalizes gay people, when all of your friends are gay, of course I'm being like very general and but making a sweeping statement, but they don't care.
Yeah.
The millennials don't care. So why does the church care? Why is it an issue? That's a big issue for me, right?
Yeah.
Why are, so, and same with things like reproductive rights. I know that's a hot topic. We don't have to sacrifice our church teaching to take a different approach, different tone with it.
Yeah.
People look at this antiquated thing, this institution, and say, I don't see myself in this. Maybe it's because it's patriarchal, maybe because it's it's very rigid. It's very dogmatic. It's more religiosity than spirituality, you know, so.
Well, you know, I'm going to go out there on a limb and I'm going to say that our church is not irrelevant, that there's wonderfulness in our church, in our practices, the sacraments, our history, our faith communities that with whom we worship on a weekly basis. So Megan, I'm going to throw this one out at you. Is there a church, a relevant church that's going to become more relevant for the future generations that are coming? Is there maybe a future church, something that kind of Karen just mentioned a little bit?
Yeah, I think so. And I know we haven't talked about the synod yet, and I think that's a huge piece. What a privilege it is to be alive in the church right now and to live through this experience. And I've been reading through the Enlarge the Space of Your Tent document that just came out, and I'm just struck by the honesty and the getting to learn about what other countries reported. It's amazing. And it helps me remember that the church is not the church of the US. This is a global church. And the issues here sometimes translate to other places, and sometimes they have their own issues. And to get to hear about women deacons in the Amazon or in Australia, well, they're not technically deacons, but they're doing the work of deacons. And so I find great hope in what the future of the church could be, and the fact that the church wants my voice and the voice of my community to be a part of that, and the voice of people who've chosen to leave the community to be a part of that too. And so I find hope in that. And I, you know, kind of somewhat connected to it, I found the pandemic to be another opportunity for us to see who are we as church when we can't go to mass, because it seems like that's the litmus test of, are you a Catholic or are you not? And if we're at home and we had to find ways to be in faith communities with one another, it reminded me of the early church of, you know, the Zoom sessions became the home prayer services, and you know, you found a way to make it work in a new setting. So those are my initial thoughts. I'm sure the panelists will join.
Oh, those were great thoughts. Thank you for that. What else brings you guys joy in our church? What do you see in the future?
If I can just, Megan, when you brought up the synod, I'm excited about that too. And I think the piece that I'm really most excited about is hoping that the church listens to the voices that came out during this, because it's one thing to say, okay, I'm going to solicit all of this information, I'm going to solicit your perspectives and your experiences, but it's in what are you going to do with it? So my hope is that there's actions that are taken from it, you know, whatever those ideas that came from it and feedback, that we're actually able to bring them to fruition, so that way, you know, there is no marginalization in the future. You know, everyone does feel that this is a family that they can all belong to, regardless of you know, how they identify, that everyone should feel welcome in his house.
Cyrus, I'm so glad you earlier mentioned Greg Boyle. One of my favoriteest quotes from Boyle, or stories from Boyle, is talking about journeying with the marginalized, journeying with those who are on the outskirts. And the whole purpose of that conversation that he's having in that regard is so that we stop throwing people away. You know, we're looking at people as disposable, and his whole ideal is exactly what we need to start, you know, motivating us, I think, a little bit more in regard to our church and how we want the future to roll, you know, roll with everyone, like what Tiffany just said, in regard to no one will be marginalized, no one will be on the outskirts. Tim, what did you want to say? I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to kind of, you know, jump on that same thing that both Tiffany and Megan were saying, and just that. So I was a Catholic school teacher, devout Catholic, and then I came out of the closet in my 30s. And I had an existential crisis. You know, I think it was something I always had avoided dealing with, you know, certainly because of faith, right? And I could have just fell off. And I went through, you know, a rough path. But at the same time, our bishop, now Cardinal McElroy, had a synod in San Diego in 2016. And one of the things that came out of that was outreach to LGBT people. So at the same time I was coming out, St. John the Evangelist was starting an LGBT ministry, and the pastor was John Dolan, who's now the Bishop of the Phoenix. And he started that. So as disappointed and frustrated as I can feel, the church, my parish was also accompanying me on my journey and adding to my, helping me along and being there and recognizing me. Now, that doesn't happen everywhere, right? There's a lot of people that don't have that and do fall off. But yeah, the synod, the engaging, the listening, that was fruitful and it helped me. And now we have a strong LGBT Catholic community at our parish, and we meet twice a month, and we're trying to bring these people back into the arms of God.
And Cyrus, where do you see our church in the future? How do you see it growing and becoming more fruitful?
Well, today is the anniversary of the Salvadoran martyrs, right? So I've been on Jesuit campuses now for 16 years, so they celebrate these martyrs, and I've had the privilege of going to El Salvador myself, which changed my life, as did going to places like Uganda. So I've been very privileged to go to places that have changed me and where I've seen people living church in a way that I hadn't expected. So that maybe gets to the point some people made before about globalization of the church and expanding our own boundaries of what that means, and taking the focus a bit off of the Americanization of the church for ourselves, right? So I find joy in dancing with my Ugandan friends and becoming a local with them, accepted into the communities, and learning how for every religious community I know, Jewish and Christian and Muslim, there is some form of dancing integrated in a way that's life-giving and joy-filled, that I find exuberant and exciting. And I'm about 3 feet off the floor in the middle of a mass, where does that happen, right? So that's joy-filled, that's exciting, that's part of the expansion of a vibrancy of the church that's in the global South that I think I've witnessed and been a part of. But also meeting the mothers of the disappeared, the desaparecidos in Salvador, and thinking about how to accompany people like that who still retain their faith, whereas I've had some minor suffering that it makes me just go all Job and or like Job's friends and want to just escape everything, right? So I think there's a real sense in meeting people who can share their lives with you in a way that brings me joy, right? And I'll just one last example that again it speaks to music because it's on the front of my mind. But I went to a screening of the new Leonard Cohen film. And at one point they show near the end of the film, Cohen's blessing at a Tel Aviv concert to Israeli and Palestinian audiences. And it's a Hebrew blessing that he gives over the audience. And Cohen, if you know, is an ancient Hebrew priestly name. So he's reabsorbing his almost priestly role as a musician on this world stage with his voice, speaking in Hebrew in Tel Aviv. And I just think that that brings me joy, musicality, and the real sense of participation in others' voices that's communal and exciting and fun. That's where the joy comes through, I think.
Liturgy is our source and summit of our faith, right? So I think that there's so much we can get out of the liturgy. Tiffany, I'm going to throw something out at you. Are you nourished by good liturgy in your parish? You belong to St. Charles Borromeo in Harlem, right? And is the preaching good? Is the music good? All of that. What does that do for you? And how do you see that being something that we can continue into the future?
So I think I'm very, very fortunate that I do belong to a parish that the liturgy and the preaching is on target for everything that I spiritually need to be still full. And so I know that's not consistent though throughout all parishes, and I think that that's essential. I think our generation feels full when we're giving good liturgy, and I think one of my fellow panelists mentioned about the homilies being culturally relevant, but also relevant to what we're experiencing in life. So we, love homilies that are reflective of the readings, but also can I be inspired by, what the pastor or the priest might want to share that might be relevant to what I'm going through, Monday through Friday, when I'm at work. We're all dealing with some real life challenges. Some of that was definitely exacerbated by COVID, but there were things that were, in existence before COVID that, it would be helpful to have the church inspire us from a spiritual perspective, because we can get fed by everything we read in media, that we see on TV, but it's one thing to, be a faith-filled person and to be fed by your parish as well. So I definitely think, preaching, the liturgy, for it to be engaging, dynamic, those are all things that keep us connected to the church. And I must second Cyrus too. I know he mentioned dancing, and I am a liturgical dancer too. I've been doing that now for about 30 years. And I think that's one aspect of a liturgy that brings a whole different dynamic to how we praise and worship, particularly in my parish.
Cyrus, you have to go to Tiffany's church someday.
Yes, all are welcome. Everyone's welcome to come
You
to
will
St.
be
Saul.
floating like you mentioned earlier. It really is. It's fantastic. Yeah, Tim, you too. You should go as a liturgical musician. You would love it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I hate to take an sort of opposite approach, but the thing I find hope in it is actually the end of the institution. I think that's where we're headed. I think the colonial church, I think global but not colonial, is sort of where we're going. And I think that relying on the same systems that have oppressed us to save us or bring us back is dangerous. So I kind of talk about it as like a Fahrenheit 451 approach, which is a sci-fi book that I had to read in school. But the premise of the book is that the state was coming and burning all books, like all the books were being burned. And so what the people did, they couldn't save the books, they couldn't hide them, they couldn't protect them. And so what they did is they memorized them, they became them. So like I would be a book, I would be Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And it would be my job to pass that story on to the next generation until it was safe again for there to be books and that story could be written down. It became someone's job in the community to pass the story on safely and to protect the story. And I would like an institution that fed me. I would like to be nourished as a parent, as a parent with young kids. I would like a little support and a little guidance and a little help. But I know the church isn't going to treat me right. They're just not. And I'm not going to look to them to treat me right or to treat my kids right or to do that. So what is it that I need to do to carry the story on to my kids, to my family? Like, what if I take on the responsibility myself to be the church that I want the church to be? And that's much more work and more frightening for me.
Let me pop in here, Karen, just because of time constraints. You actually probably just addressed one of the questions, which I want to move to now.
Sure,
some of the questions that we've been getting. One of the questions was, the latest synodal document speaks of enlarging the tent, but can you enlarge a tent and still hold on to the narrow gate? Well phrased.
We have to stop thinking in binaries. Like that's a problem with faith and institutional faith. It's either this or that.
Right.
God is both. You can have a narrow gate and you can have a big tent. What do you mean by narrow gate? Why do we always have to put everything so this or that, either or? To what Karen was saying, one of the things that's given me life is Father James Martin and his outreach to LGBT people. And he always says, it's your church too. And I've always seen in my head, and I might be right or wrong, that someday the church will have women priests and married priests and people will be out and open and gay. And because if it doesn't, the church is going to just implode, right? It's just going to become narrow until no one's in it anymore. And what we do with our LGBT ministries, we say, I'm Catholic, and I don't care that the rest of the church doesn't agree. I'm Catholic, so say something. I am Catholic. This is my church, so it's going to be the church, as Karen said.
Yeah.
I'm going to be the Catholic Church, and doesn't mean I'm making up my own rules.
Right.
But I'm still Catholic, whether you want to accept me or not. So
yeah, Timothy, one of the people in our audience really does, and I'm sure many of us do, appreciate your honesty and the experiences you've had, as well as other LGBTQ people in our church, and you're connecting to them, as Tiffany is to Black Catholics, as the women here are speaking to women who've been marginalized. So we're all addressing, to some extent or another, some marginality in our church, and how we're trying to address that and bring more people in. So there's one group we haven't talked about though yet. And one of the folks in our audience said parishes and church communities often direct a lot of attention to youth ministry and young adult ministry. But for Gen X, what might a not so young anymore ministry look like? What would it require on the church's part or on our part? I love this question. What would a not so young anymore ministry look like?
It looks like somebody making time to do it.
Yeah.
Somebody's got to stand up.
Mhm.
Most churches have one pastor and they're already, either they can only do so much.
Yeah.
But that
I
might
actually,
be a too practical response. I don't know.
but I have to actually say, I don't see a lot of churches doing a lot in regard to youth and young adult ministry. So that has not been my experience, at least not on the East Coast. So it's just interesting, the different perspectives that we bring to the table.
I mean, it's huge. It was huge growing up in the 90s on the West Coast. Young Life came into Catholic churches, and that goes to what Karen was saying in the beginning about formation. I mean, that's whether you're a millennial, Gen X, or baby boomer, you need to have ministries that develop formation and spiritual experiences. And it starts with social. You need to have a social group. You need to reach out to the elderly or to the divorced or single parents and have a place for people to gather. It starts with just getting together and feeling welcome. But yeah, I mean, I think practically it's just somebody has to do it.
Yeah. Well, somebody just mentioned in the chat that, what about single middle-aged adults? That's a great group, which I'm part of. So I would love for some outreach in that. But let me throw another question out here. This is, I think, a little bit more tough. Do people see themselves as sinners in need of salvation? Is that a concept that is still something that we're thinking about these days?
I can lead off the discussion on this
Sure.
one. This is not me that I'm quoting, but I've heard it said that the church told people that God loves us and we believed him. And so that kind of led to the end of going to confession Saturday nights, and we really, as a church, embraced God loved us, and the fear of damnation kind of has trickled away over time. That's my understanding of what happened. So based on my experience, I would say most people, that is not the focus of their faith. It's more about a loving relationship with God and loving relationship with others. And so even the phrasing of that question would not be how people that I have interacted with that are my age would even think of it.
An LGBT person, that's a tough question to answer because we're raised being told that for something that is nothing we have control over, we're sinners for it. So like maybe people that have been marginalized in other ways might feel that. So our whole life is overcoming this idea that God hates us, that we are sinners. Not everybody's natural sin, but what the people say is, oh, but you have more than the rest of us because you're gay, right? We have to separate ourselves. So there is always this struggle with that. But it is an interesting question too. Yeah, maybe what do we consider sin, right? Before it was all this focus on, oh, what's a moral, a venial sin, but mortal, but maybe our lack of social justice is a very mortal sin. Maybe our lack of outreach is a very mortal sin. Maybe our marginalization of our own community, or maybe we have a different view of it, so.
Yeah, and I would say that's partly why I was using the language of woundedness and healing rather than maybe sin. I think, and something I had prepared as comments were related to Spike Lee's films, where he repeatedly uses the phrase "wake up" in somebody's mouth in the film, right? So there's a lot of negative language about that kind of thing, about waking up, but it's real for all of us, right? We all wake up at some point to who we are. Maybe it's later than we would have liked, or what we're like and what resonates in our lives. But we also have journeys of deep pain and sorrow and difficulty that need acknowledgement and that we recognize. It's not like we can't see where we might need some healing. And so that's, I threw away jokingly the notion of psilocybin, but I actually hold a lot of hope out for any kind of combined ways of spiritual healing that address what I think is really going on with the sinning and salvation question. And so I think that really, if I think about it, a lot of people in my generation still stay because they do believe deep down that the church can save them, but they won't use the language of sin and salvation in the same way. What's meant is something here, and this is what even Hans Urs von Balthasar said, that the church gets you away from yourself, right? The church, just like drugs can, or any other mode of self-transcendence. There's a way in which the church could be a place where you're healed from an attachment to self that's wounded, and that has caused me great pain of talking to myself in such negative ways for so long, just to learn how to have some self-compassion from the Buddhist tradition, right? The idea that maybe sin and salvation, is the Christian and Jewish language, but we also need it complemented by other modes of orienting ourselves to our woundedness that doesn't make it feel so demonizing, because we just crush ourselves, or I know I crush myself in a masochistic way, unless I'm provided with some hope that in fact I'm not damned as a consequence, but actually loved, because I beat myself up enough as it is. I don't need more of somebody else doing it for me. So.
Well, let me share one of the comments one of our folks in the outer world there just shared with us. I think one thing we need to do is try to dig deep in our own tradition to find better answers than the ones in our bipolar political system, to have a more holistic view of human life, of love, of economics, of society, of politics. Anyone want to address that? I mean, for me, the sacraments are paramount. So I wouldn't want to live without the Eucharist in my life. So
I really think the model that I find in the gospel just strikes me as the big capital T truth. Dan Berrigan said of Dorothy Day, she lived as if the truth were true. And I do think if you push away the institution, which is like a military colonial mechanism, and you go back to the gospel, within our own tradition, we have deep wisdom, we have community, we have a tradition that is hope-filled, right? Like we have within ourselves the truth, right? And that truth is universal. It isn't like the Catholics have the truth, but our tradition can tap into these beautiful, like life-giving, life-altering truths. And so I do think we can own what's ours, and we can and do that. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. I have time for one more question, and we have to keep the answers really succinct. Okay. So one of the folks in our audience just shared this: gender and sexual orientation oppression are paramount. Thank you, especially Karen and Timothy, for raising these important issues. As an GLBT person, I am often told, love the sinner, hate the sin. Ooh. The church holds unscientific teachings on sexuality, which call LGBTQ sinners. No hope here until the science of church teaching changes. Succinct response.
Not impossible. You can't have succinct response.
You got to. We're running out of time.
Okay. Love the sin or hate the sin is the worst thing you can ever say to somebody, especially gay. It's so dismissive and cold, and you mean well. That I know, and that's not the person that said that. But just anybody out there, never say that, and look it up, research why it's that. And yes, the church needs to change its teaching on sexuality. We used to promote a lot of things that we don't. In Deuteronomy, it says a virgin should be stoned. That's the word of God. We interpret it differently now. Right? A non-virgin should be stoned. Sorry. We need to revisit this.
And are you chastised at all, by the way, for, ridicule, or are you ridiculed for reimagining the church? Has anyone faced that when you've had conversations?
Well, I mean, I as the person that runs the LGBT ministry, I get emails once a month for someone, anonymous person says, "Don't you know you're leading people to hell?" But those people don't matter, and I don't care, because I'm all I'm doing is trying to spread love.
Yeah.
Say something.
when Sean and I were getting married, we had to go to pre-Cana, and this like hilarious conversation about not using condoms. It just was like, you're so like, just the word irrelevant and harmful. I guess irrelevant and harmful science is sort of what that's what I would say about those.
Mhm.
Like,
Okay.
yeah, not good.
So I think we're at a point where we need to say goodnight.
Yeah,
What a great conversation. Thank you, everyone. Hi, Marie,
thank
Sister Maria.
you. I'm glad to be back again. Thank all of you for participating. It was lively, as I said it would be, and there were a multitude of diverse perspectives represented tonight, and it was great. It was great to hear people speak freely, speak their mind, and bring us some insights about how the church might be more relevant. And I like that last question about digging into the church's tradition.
Mhm.
Sometimes what we do is we walk through the narrow gate with some ideas, and we forget the wide tent that the synod is talking about, because the tradition of the church has sustained people for 2,000 years, and we have to find a way to bring that tradition back. So I'm grateful to all of you. There were many more questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of them, but I wish you all a good evening. For those of you who are in the New York metropolitan area, on December 11th, the Gaudete Sunday, we have a big multicultural Spirit Alive celebration at our Mother House Chapel in Brentwood, New York, and mariachi band, because it's the eve of Our Lady of Guadalupe. So it's a wild afternoon. Tiffany, you'd like it. You could come and dance. And I invite all of you who are listening virtually to join us that day. It starts at 1 o'clock. There's information on our website. Last thing, anybody who'd like to make a donation to Spirit Alive, we're always grateful to get a donation. And we're always grateful to all of you out there in our virtual community for joining with us and being open to God's Spirit through the voices of those we gather here and the voices of those who are out there waiting to be heard. So thanks, everybody. Good evening. God bless. Take care. Bye now.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Take
Thanks.
care.
Bye-bye.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Happy Thanksgiving.